Harold's hand shot up in defiance as the pregnant mare stood trembling in the auction ring, her frightened eyes meeting his with a silent plea that shattered his 2 years of grief-stricken isolation. The auctioneer's hammer fell with a thunderous crack, and in that moment, the 72-year-old widower who came for coffee had just purchased a desperate creature whose unborn foal's miracle would heal wounds deeper than either could know. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The auction barn reeked of hay, manure, and desperation. Wooden panels lined the perimeter of the auction ring, where dozens of horses had already passed through, their fates decided in mere seconds by the casual raise of a numbered paddle. In the dimly lit holding area, away from the fluorescent lights of the main ring, stood a chestnut mare with a striking white blaze running down her face. Her coat, once glossy and vibrant, had dulled from neglect. Her ribs weren't showing yet, but her hip bones jutted out just enough to reveal that proper feeding hadn't been a priority for her previous owners. Despite her condition, there was still a quiet dignity in how she held her head, in the gentle brown eyes that seemed to understand far more than anyone might expect. Her name was Willow, though no one at the auction knew or cared. To them, she was just number 37, another piece of livestock to be sold to the highest bidder, or more likely, considering her condition, to the kill buyers who lurked at the back of the auction house. These men, with their blank expressions and calculating eyes, purchased horses by the pound, cramming them into trailers bound for slaughterhouses across the border. They paid little attention to age, breed, or potential. They certainly paid no attention to the slight swell of Willow's belly, the barely noticeable sign that she was carrying new life. The mare had belonged to a once prosperous breeding farm that had fallen on hard times. When the bank foreclosed, the animals were the first assets to be liquidated. The owner, a woman who had once whispered promises of forever into Willow's ears, couldn't bear to watch as her prized horses were loaded onto trailers. She'd turned away, tears streaming down her face, telling herself there was nothing she could do. That's how Willow ended up here, confused and afraid, the scent of fear emanating from the stalls around her. Next up, number 37, the auctioneer called out, his voice tinny through the speakers. 7-year-old chestnut mare, quarter-horse cross, no papers, sold as is. 2 workers opened the gate, and Willow hesitated before one of them slapped her hindquarters with a plastic rod, sending her trotting into the auction ring. The bright lights made her blink, and she circled nervously, her hooves clattering on the concrete floor. The auctioneer barely looked at her before starting his rapid-fire chant. "What am I bid for this fine mare? Who'll give me 300? 300, do I hear 300? The room remained silent. In the front row, a heavy-set man in a flannel shirt nudged his companion and whispered something that made them both chuckle. Their eyes lingered on Willow's swollen belly. "All right, let's start lower. 200? 150? A man at the back raised his paddle lazily. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, and his expression remained impassive as he placed his bid. One of the kill buyers. "I have 150 from number 82. Do I hear 200? The silence in the room was deafening. Willow paced in a small circle, her ears flicking nervously. 150 going once. In the third row, an older man sat quietly. Harold Miller had not planned to attend the auction that day. At 72, he had promised his late wife that he would slow down, that he would enjoy the modest retirement they had saved for. But Martha had been gone for 2 years now, and the silence in their farmhouse had become unbearable. The 20 acres they had tended together felt empty without her laughter, without the animals they had raised side by side for over 40 years. Harold had sold most of the livestock after Martha passed. It was too much work for one aging man, and his heart wasn't in it anymore. He kept only his old gelding, Thunder, who at 25 was more a companion than a working animal. This morning, Harold had driven to town for coffee at the local diner, as was his Saturday routine. He overheard two men talking about the auction, about how many horses were being sold because of the drought and rising hay prices. Something pulled at him, a memory of Martha saying they should never stop helping if they could. Before he knew it, he was parking his truck at the auction yard. 150 going twice. Harold looked at Willow, really looked at her. Beyond the dull coat and the nervous stance, he saw something in her eyes that reminded him of Martha's favorite mare. Intelligence, gentleness, and something else. A silent plea that seemed to reach across the noisy auction barn and touch his heart. His hand moved before his brain had fully decided. The numbered paddle rose. 200, he said, his voice stronger than he expected. The auctioneer's eyebrows rose slightly. 200 from number 43. Do I hear 250? The kill buyer at the back frowned and raised his paddle again. 250. Harold's jaw set. He hadn't come here to buy a horse. He didn't need another mouth to feed. But as Willow turned in the ring, he noticed the slight awkwardness in her movement, the way she protected her belly. And suddenly, he knew. 300, he called out. A murmur went through the crowd. The kill buyer's expression darkened. 350. Harold didn't hesitate. 400. The auctioneer's patter picked up speed, sensing a bidding war. 400. Do I hear 450? The kill buyer studied Harold for a moment, then shook his head slightly and lowered his paddle. At the price per pound, the mare wasn't worth more to him. There would be other horses today. 400 going once, going twice. Sold to number 43 for $400. A young worker approached Willow with a halter, quickly securing it before leading her out of the ring through a side gate. Harold sat for a moment, stunned by what he had just done. $400 he hadn't planned to spend, for a horse he hadn't planned to buy. Martha would have either laughed or scolded him, probably both. With a sigh, he rose from his seat and made his way to the cashier's office to complete the paperwork. By the time he finished, Willow had been moved to a holding pen. A different worker handed him the lead rope with a bored expression. All yours, mister. Harold approached Willow carefully, speaking in low, soothing tones. Easy, girl. Easy now. He reached out slowly to let her sniff his hand. The mare's nostrils flared as she took in his scent, her eyes watchful, but not panicked. After a moment, she lowered her head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. That's it, Harold murmured. We're going to be just fine. He gently led her to his trailer, an old two-horse model he'd kept more out of habit than necessity. Willow balked at the ramp, her eyes wide with uncertainty. I know, Harold said softly. I know you've had a rough go of it, but I promise you, this is the last bad day you'll have for a while. Whether it was his tone or simply exhaustion, Willow finally stepped into the trailer. Harold secured the divider and closed the back, his movements deliberate and careful. As he climbed into the driver's seat of his truck, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. Martha would definitely be laughing now. What am I doing, old girl? He murmured, imagining his wife sitting beside him as she had for so many years. I'm too old to be taking in strays. But as he started the engine, a sense of purpose settled over him. Something he hadn't felt since Martha's passing. Sometimes the heart knows what it needs before the mind catches up. Today, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he needed to save this mare. The drive back to Harold's farm took nearly an hour, and with each passing mile, doubt crept into his mind. His property had once been a bustling homestead with sheep, chickens, a small herd of cattle, and several horses. Now the barn stood half empty, the pastures overgrown in places. What business did he have bringing home a pregnant mare when he could barely find the motivation to maintain what he already had? Thunder greeted them with a curious whicker as Harold's truck crunched up the gravel driveway. The old gelding paced along the fence line of his paddock, his gray muzzle extended toward the trailer. Harold parked close to the barn and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts before climbing out. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as he walked around to the back of the trailer. "Welcome home, Willow," he said as he opened the door. The name had come to him during the drive. She reminded him of the willow tree that stood by the creek at the back of his property, bending but never breaking through years of harsh weather. The mare backed cautiously down the ramp, her eyes wide as she surveyed her new surroundings. Her nostrils flared, taking in the scent of hay, the nearby creek, and Thunder's curious presence. Harold gave her a moment to acclimate before gently leading her toward the barn. Inside, he selected a stall that had been empty since Martha's old mare passed 3 years ago. Fresh bedding covered the floor, and the water trough had been automatically filled that morning, one of the few modern conveniences Martha had insisted on before she got sick. Harold removed Willow's halter and stepped back, allowing her space to explore. "It's not much," he told her, "but it's safe." Willow circled the stall twice before approaching the water trough. She drank deeply, then raised her head, water dripping from her muzzle. For the first time since he'd seen her at the auction, Harold thought he detected a slight relaxation in her posture. "You rest now," he said. "I'll bring you some hay in a bit." Harold walked out to Thunder's paddock, where the gelding was waiting expectantly by the gate. The old horse nudged Harold's shoulder, blowing softly through his nostrils. "Yes, I brought home a friend for you," Harold admitted, scratching Thunder behind the ears. "Don't know what I was thinking, but there you have it." Thunder snorted as if in approval. "She's in a family way," Harold continued, the habit of talking to his animals more ingrained after 2 years alone. "Going to need a vet to look her over, figure out how far along she is." He sighed. "Your mom would say I've lost my marbles, bringing home a pregnant horse at my age." Thunder just blinked his soft brown eyes, looking wise beyond his years. By the time Harold had finished his evening chores and brought fresh hay to both horses, darkness had fallen. He stood in the doorway of the barn, watching as Willow nibbled tentatively at the hay. Her ears remained alert, swiveling to catch every sound, but she seemed to be settling in. Tomorrow would bring questions and responsibilities, but for tonight it was enough that she was safe. Morning arrived with the insistent crowing of Harold's rooster, a stubborn bird that had outlived its entire flock. Harold rose with the sun out of habit, his joints protesting the early hour. After a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, he pulled on his work boots and headed out to check on Willow. The mare was standing quietly in her stall, watching as he approached. In the clear morning light, Harold could better assess her condition. Her coat was dull and her mane tangled, but there was an alertness in her eyes that gave him hope. The slight swell of her belly confirmed his suspicions from the day before. She was definitely in foal, though how far along remained to be determined. "Well, Miss Willow," he said softly, "looks like we need to get you seen by Doc Richards." He picked up his cell phone, another concession to modernity that Martha had insisted upon, and dialed the local veterinarian. Ellen Richards had taken over her father's practice 5 years ago and had been caring for Harold's animals ever since. "Harold Miller," she greeted warmly when she answered. "It's been a while. How's Thunder doing?" "Thunder's fine," Harold replied. "But I've got a new arrival that needs your attention. Picked up a mare at the auction yesterday. She's in foal." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You bought a pregnant mare? That doesn't sound like you, Harold." "Wasn't planning on it," he admitted. "But she needed help, and well—" "Say no more," Ellen chuckled. "Martha would be proud. I can come by this afternoon around 2 if that works for you." Harold agreed and hung up, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Ellen was one of the few people who understood his attachment to the farm and the animals, who never suggested that maybe it was time for him to sell and move into town like so many other aging farmers. He spent the morning cleaning out the barn and checking the fence line of the small paddock attached to it. If Willow was going to have a foal, she'd need a safe place to move around. By noon, he was satisfied with his work and returned to the barn to check on her. To his surprise, Willow had finished all her hay and was standing alert at the stall door, ears pricked forward with interest as he approached. "Feeling a bit better today, are we?" he asked, reaching out slowly to stroke her neck. She tensed momentarily, then relaxed under his touch. "That's it. We're going to be friends, you and I." Harold led her out to the small paddock, keeping a respectful distance as she explored her new territory. Her movements were cautious, but less stiff than the day before. She even stretched her neck over the fence toward Thunder's paddock, where the gelding stood watching with keen interest. "You'll meet him properly soon enough," Harold promised, "once Doc Richards gives you the all-clear." The veterinarian arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, her truck kicking up dust as it came down the long driveway. Ellen was in her early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and laugh lines already forming around her eyes. She'd grown up in this community, learning the veterinary trade at her father's side before heading off to college. When she returned with her degree, she brought modern techniques back to the rural practice but never lost the personal touch that made her father beloved among the local farmers. "So this is your new girl," Ellen said as she approached the paddock where Willow was grazing. "She's lovely, despite being a bit underweight." "Name's Willow," Harold said. "Don't know much else about her. Auction house just listed her as a quarter-horse cross, no papers." Ellen nodded, assessing the mare with a professional eye. "Looks like there's some thoroughbred in her bloodline. See the fine bone structure in her legs, and that deep chest." She smiled. "You've got a good eye, Harold. Underneath that neglect is a fine horse." Harold felt a surge of pride that surprised him. "Think you can tell how far along she is?" "Let's have a look," Ellen said, gathering her equipment from the truck. The examination was thorough, with Ellen checking Willow's teeth, eyes, hooves, and overall condition before focusing on her pregnancy. The mare remained remarkably calm throughout, as if sensing that Ellen meant her no harm. "Based on palpation and her size, I'd estimate she's about 7 months along," Ellen finally announced. "The foal seems to be developing normally, though I'd like to do an ultrasound to be sure. Can you bring her in next week? I've got the equipment at the clinic." 7 months, Harold repeated, doing the mental math. "So we're looking at..." "Early spring," Ellen confirmed. "April, most likely. Perfect timing for a foal." She hesitated, then added gently, "Harold, are you sure about this? Foaling season can be intense, especially with a mare you don't know well." Harold looked at Willow, who was now contentedly grazing again, seeming more at home with each passing hour. Something about her quiet resilience reminded him of Martha, the way she had faced every challenge with grace right up until the end. "I'm sure," he said firmly. "She deserves a chance, and so does her baby." After Ellen left, Harold leaned against the paddock fence watching Willow graze, 7 months pregnant. The responsibility of it settled on his shoulders like a physical weight. It had been years since a foal was born on his property, not since Thunder's last offspring, a spirited filly that Martha had trained herself before selling to a young rider who needed a gentle mount. "Got ourselves into quite a situation, haven't we?" he murmured to Willow. The mare lifted her head at the sound of his voice, her ears swiveling forward with interest. Something about her attentiveness made Harold smile. "Well, we've got time to prepare at least." That evening, Harold found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, researching. He pulled out Martha's old horse breeding books from the shelves in the study, dust coating his fingers as he flipped through pages that had once been consulted daily. The familiar handwriting in the margins brought a lump to his throat. Martha had been meticulous, documenting every foaling, every vaccination, every milestone in their animals' lives. "What would you do, Martha?" he whispered to the empty room. The next day, Harold drove to the feed store in town. It was a modest establishment that had somehow survived the arrival of big box stores in neighboring counties. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and the owner, Bill Peterson, looked up from behind the counter. "Harold Miller," Bill said with genuine warmth. "Twice in 1 month, to what do we owe the honor?" Harold chuckled. At his age, trips to town were becoming less frequent. "Need some special feed, Bill. Got myself a pregnant mare." Bill's eyebrows shot up. "A brood mare? Thought you were scaling back operations." "Wasn't planned," Harold admitted, explaining the auction and Willow's condition. "Ellen says she's about 7 months along and underweight. Need to get her condition up before the foal comes." Bill nodded. "All business now. You'll want a high-quality mare and foal feed, higher protein content, more calcium." He led Harold down an aisle stacked with feed bags. "This one here's what most of our breeders use, and you might want to add a vitamin supplement, especially since she's come from a situation where she wasn't getting proper care." By the time Harold left the store, his truck was loaded with specialized feed, mineral blocks, and supplements. His wallet was considerably lighter, but a sense of purpose had taken root in his chest. He hadn't felt this focused since Martha's illness had forced him to take over the farm operations entirely. On the drive home, he passed the old Dawson place. The once thriving horse farm had been subdivided after Jim Dawson died, most of it sold to developers. Only the original farmhouse and a few acres remained, now owned by Jim's daughter, Rebecca. Harold slowed as he noticed someone working in what used to be the training ring. On impulse, he pulled into the driveway. Rebecca was in her 40s now, but Harold still remembered her as the skinny teenager who had helped Martha with their foalings in exchange for riding lessons. She looked up as his truck approached, shading her eyes against the sun. Recognition dawned on her face, and she smiled. "Harold Miller, what brings you out this way?" Harold climbed out of his truck, feeling suddenly self-conscious about his unannounced visit. "Was passing by and saw you working. Thought I'd stop and say hello." Rebecca wiped her hands on her jeans and walked over to greet him properly. "It's good to see you. How's everything at your place?" "Getting by," Harold said. "Actually, I've got a situation I could use some advice on. Just picked up a pregnant mare at the auction. Due in spring." Rebecca's expression shifted to one of keen interest. "A rescue case?" "You could say that. Kill buyer was bidding on her." Rebecca shook her head, a flash of anger in her eyes. "Some people." "What's her condition?" "Underweight, according to Ellen Richards. About 7 months along." "You'll need to be careful with her nutrition," Rebecca said, immediately falling into the role of advisor. "Bring her weight up gradually. Too fast can cause problems for the foal." "That's actually why I stopped," Harold admitted. "Martha always said you had a gift with the difficult cases." Pride and sadness flickered across Rebecca's face at the mention of his late wife. "She taught me everything I know." They talked for nearly an hour, with Rebecca offering practical advice about preparing for the foal and managing Willow's care. As Harold was about to leave, Rebecca hesitated, then said, "I could come by sometime if you'd like. See her for myself, maybe help you set up a foaling stall." Harold felt a rush of relief. "I'd appreciate that more than I can say. How about this weekend? Saturday morning?" The agreement made, Harold drove home with a lighter heart. The community he'd withdrawn from after Martha's death was still there, still willing to help if only he reached out. The next few days fell into a new routine. Harold started Willow on the special feed, carefully following the recommendations to increase her nutrition gradually. Each morning and evening, he spent time with her, talking softly as she ate, reaching out occasionally to stroke her neck or brush her coat. The mare remained cautious but showed signs of warming to him. By the end of the week, she would walk to the fence when she saw him coming, ears pricked forward in what seemed like greeting. Thunder, too, was developing a relationship with Willow. Harold had moved the gelding to the adjacent paddock, allowing the horses to interact over the fence. At first, Thunder had shown off, prancing along the fence line with more energy than Harold had seen in years. Willow had watched with apparent amusement, occasionally stretching her neck over the fence to touch noses with him. On Saturday morning, Harold was up earlier than usual, tidying the barn before Rebecca's visit. He found himself oddly nervous, as if her assessment of his preparations would somehow validate or invalidate his decision to take on Willow's care. Rebecca arrived just after 9, her practical truck pulling up beside the barn. She climbed out wearing work clothes and boots, hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. Harold led her straight to the paddock where Willow was grazing. "She's beautiful," Rebecca said after studying the mare for several minutes. "Good conformation, nice deep chest. Once she puts on some weight, she'll be stunning." Harold felt an absurd surge of pride, as if he'd personally created Willow instead of simply purchasing her at auction. "Ellen thinks there's some thoroughbred in her." "I'd agree with that. Look at the refinement in her head and those long legs." Rebecca leaned against the fence. "She's settling in well." "Better than I expected. First few days she was skittish, but she's calming down. Even lets me groom her now." They watched as Willow raised her head to look at them, then deliberately returned to grazing. The mare's movements were more fluid than they had been a week ago, the initial stiffness fading as proper nutrition and gentle exercise began to take effect. "She trusts you," Rebecca observed. "That's half the battle with rescue cases." They spent the next hour walking the property, with Rebecca offering suggestions about pasture rotation and pointing out areas where the fencing needed repair before a curious foal arrived. In the barn, she helped Harold plan the conversion of a storage area into a spacious foaling stall. "You'll want plenty of clean straw when the time comes," she advised, "and good lighting. If she foals at night, you'll need to see what's happening." Harold nodded, taking mental notes. "Martha always kept a kit ready during foaling season. Guess I should put one together. I've got some extras at my place: clean towels, umbilical clamp, disinfectant. I'll bring them over next time." As they walked back to her truck, Rebecca paused. "Harold, I've been thinking. I've got a small mare at home that I was planning to train for a therapeutic riding program. Could use someone experienced to help. If you're interested, maybe we could work out a trade. Your help with training in exchange for me being on call when Willow gets close to foaling." Harold recognized the offer for what it was, a gentle way of ensuring he wouldn't be alone when the critical moment arrived without wounding his pride. "Think I'd like that," he said simply. After Rebecca left, Harold returned to the paddock where Willow was now dozing in the winter sun. The mare opened her eyes as he approached, regarding him with what he fancied was growing affection. "Made a friend today," he told her. "Someone who's going to help us when your little one decides to make an appearance." Willow nickered softly and stepped toward him, stretching her neck over the fence. Tentatively, Harold reached out and stroked her forehead. The mare leaned into his touch, a small gesture of trust that meant more to him than he could express. For the first time since Martha's death, Harold felt the stirrings of a community reforming around him. The empty spaces left by loss were beginning to fill again, not with replacements for what was gone, but with new connections, new purpose, all because of an impulse bid at an auction he'd never planned to attend. As winter settled over the countryside, Harold found himself with more energy than he'd had in years. The farm, which had fallen into a state of benign neglect after Martha's passing, began to show signs of revival. He repaired fences, cleared brush, and spent long afternoons in the barn, preparing the foaling stall that would eventually welcome Willow's baby. The ultrasound at Ellen's clinic had confirmed what they already suspected, a healthy foal developing right on schedule. The images on the screen had brought unexpected tears to Harold's eyes, a new life against all odds. Ellen had printed one of the clearer images for him, and Harold had placed it on the refrigerator, secured by a magnet from the local feed store. "Looks like you've been busy," Rebecca commented one crisp December morning as she pulled into the driveway. True to her word, she had been coming by regularly, both to check on Willow and to enlist Harold's help with her young mare, a spirited bay named Ginger. Harold nodded, gesturing toward the newly reinforced paddock fence. "Figured a curious foal would find every weak spot in no time." "Smart thinking," Rebecca said, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "How's our mama doing today?" "Getting rounder by the day," Harold said with a hint of pride, "and her coat's finally getting that shine back." They walked together to the barn where Willow was staying during the coldest part of the day. The mare greeted them with a soft nicker, her eyes bright and alert. Her condition had improved dramatically over the past month. The careful feeding regimen had filled out her frame, and regular grooming had restored luster to her coat. Even her mane, once tangled and dull, now fell in silky waves along her neck. "She looks fantastic," Rebecca said, running a practiced hand along Willow's side. "You've done wonders with her, Harold." Harold shrugged off the compliment, though privately he felt a deep satisfaction in Willow's transformation. "Just following the program you and Ellen laid out. Don't sell yourself short. The best nutrition in the world won't help if the horse doesn't feel safe and loved." Rebecca patted Willow's neck. "And this one clearly does." After checking on Willow, they spent the morning working with Ginger in the round pen. Despite the cold, Harold found himself enjoying the familiar rhythm of training, the subtle communication between human and horse, the small victories of mutual understanding. It reminded him of the days when he and Martha had worked side by side, finishing each other's sentences and anticipating each other's moves in a dance perfected over decades. By early afternoon, a light snow had begun to fall. Rebecca glanced at the sky with concern. "I should head back before this gets worse. Same time next week?" Harold nodded, surprised at how much he was looking forward to it. "I'll be here." After Rebecca left, Harold returned to the barn to check on Willow once more before evening chores. The mare was standing quietly in her stall, watching the snow fall through the open top half of the door. She turned at his approach, nickering in recognition. "Hello, pretty girl," Harold said, reaching out to stroke her neck. "Looks like we're in for some real winter weather finally." Willow leaned into his touch, a gesture that still surprised him with its trust. When he'd first brought her home, she'd flinched at sudden movements, her eyes wide with fear. Now she sought out his company, following him around the paddock when he was fixing fences or cleaning water troughs. "You know," he said as he filled her feed bucket, "you remind me of Martha sometimes. She never gave up either, not even at the end." Willow munched contentedly, occasionally bumping Harold's shoulder with her nose in a gesture that seemed almost affectionate. Harold found himself talking more and more to the mare, sharing thoughts and memories he'd kept locked away since Martha's death. There was something therapeutic about Willow's quiet presence, her attentive ears that never judged or pitied. That night, a full winter storm descended on the region. Harold woke several times to check on the animals trudging through deepening snow to make sure the barn was secure and the horses had fresh water. Thunder, with his thick winter coat, seemed unfazed by the weather, but Harold worried about Willow and her pregnancy. By morning, nearly a foot of snow covered the ground, transforming the farm into a pristine white landscape. Harold spent the day shuttling between the house and barn, keeping paths cleared and making sure his charges were comfortable. To his relief, Willow showed no signs of distress, contentedly munching on the extra hay he provided. "Never seen a horse take to winter like you," he told her as he brushed ice crystals from her blanket. "Most mares I've known would be pacing and fretting in this weather." The storm lasted 2 days, followed by a clear, bone-chilling cold that made the snow crunch underfoot. On the 3rd day, Harold was surprised to hear the sound of an engine struggling up his driveway. He opened the front door to find Ellen's truck making its way through the partially cleared path. "Didn't expect to see anyone till the thaw," he called as she climbed out, medical bag in hand. "Just checking on my patients," Ellen replied, her face half hidden behind a thick scarf. "Figured you might be concerned about Willow in this weather." Harold felt a rush of gratitude for the young veterinarian's dedication. "She seems fine, but I'd appreciate you taking a look." They walked to the barn together, Harold filling Ellen in on Willow's progress since the ultrasound. Inside, the temperature was considerably warmer than outside, though still cold enough to see their breath. Willow greeted them with interest, especially when she spotted Ellen's familiar medical bag. "Someone remembers where the treats come from," Ellen laughed, pulling a carrot from her pocket. She gave it to Willow, who accepted it delicately. "Let's see how you and that baby are doing." The examination was thorough but quick, Ellen's experienced hands checking vital signs and the firmness of Willow's growing belly. "Everything looks good," she pronounced finally. "The foal is positioned normally, and Willow's handling the pregnancy like a pro." "Any concerns about the cold?" Harold asked. "Not as long as she's got proper shelter and plenty of quality food. Horses are pretty resilient to cold, much more so than heat." Ellen patted Willow's side appreciatively. "This one's in excellent condition now, thanks to your care." After Ellen left, promising to return in a few weeks for another checkup, Harold spent some extra time with Willow. He added fresh bedding to her stall and gave her an extra flake of the premium hay he'd been saving for the worst of the winter weather. "We're going to be just fine," he told her as he closed the stall door for the night. "You, me, and that little one you're carrying." As he walked back to the house through the silent, snow-covered fields, Harold felt a peace he hadn't experienced since before Martha's illness. The grief was still there. He suspected it always would be. But alongside it now was something new. Purpose, connection, perhaps even joy. In the farmhouse, he warmed himself with a cup of coffee and pulled out one of Martha's old photo albums. It was filled with pictures of foals born on their farm over the years, spindly-legged newborns standing for the first time, Martha's face glowing with pride beside each new arrival. "I think you'd approve, old girl," he said to the empty room. "Maybe you even had a hand in this somehow." Outside, the winter stars glittered coldly in a clear sky, and somewhere in the barn, a pregnant mare slept peacefully, unaware of the healing she had brought to an old man's broken heart. Winter gradually released its grip on the countryside as February melted into March. The days grew longer, and hints of green began to emerge from beneath patches of melting snow. Harold marked each day on the kitchen calendar, counting down to Willow's expected foaling date in mid-April. The mare's belly had grown impressively, and her movements had slowed, becoming more deliberate as she adjusted to her changing body. "Not much longer now," Harold told her one morning as he refreshed the water in her stall. Willow acknowledged him with a soft nicker, her eyes peaceful as he ran a gentle hand over her swollen side. Sometimes he thought he could feel the foal moving, a faint ripple beneath his palm that never failed to fill him with wonder. The foaling stall was ready, spacious, deeply bedded with clean straw, and equipped with the special infrared camera Rebecca had helped him install. The camera linked to a monitor in Harold's bedroom, allowing him to check on Willow during the night without disturbing her. It was a far cry from the days when he and Martha had taken turns sleeping in the barn during foaling season, but the technology gave him peace of mind. "You've thought of everything," Ellen commented during her monthly checkup in early March. "Most first-time breeders aren't this prepared." Harold smiled ruefully. "Not exactly my first rodeo. Just been a while." Ellen nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Well, she's in excellent condition. The foal is positioned correctly, and all signs point to a normal delivery." She paused, then added, "But you know how unpredictable foaling can be, even with experienced mares." "That's why I've got you on speed dial," Harold said, "and Rebecca's promised to stay over once we get closer to the date." After Ellen left, Harold sat on an overturned bucket in Willow's stall, talking to her as he'd grown accustomed to doing. The mare stood nearby, occasionally nudging his shoulder as if encouraging him to continue. "Never thought I'd be doing this again at my age," he confessed. "After Martha passed, I figured that part of my life was over, just me and Thunder winding down together." He stroked Willow's neck. "Then you came along and turned everything upside down." The mare's ear flicked toward him, attentive to his voice. "Can't say I mind, though," Harold continued softly. "Gives me a reason to get up in the morning, something to look forward to." As the days passed, Harold found himself increasingly drawn into the community he'd withdrawn from after Martha's death. Word had spread about Willow and her impending foal, and neighbors began stopping by with offers of help, or simply to check on the mare's progress. Some brought spare halters or lead ropes for the expected foal. Others shared advice from their own breeding experiences. One afternoon, Harold was surprised to find a truck he didn't recognize parked in his driveway. A middle-aged woman stood leaning against it, her expression uncertain as she watched him approach. "Can I help you?" Harold asked. The woman straightened. "Mr. Miller, I'm Laura Sanderson. I used to own Willow, before the bank took everything." Harold felt a moment of protectiveness toward the mare, but the genuine distress in Laura's eyes softened his reaction. "She's doing well," he said simply. "Would you like to see her?" Relief washed over Laura's face. "If you don't mind. I've been worried about her ever since." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Harold led her to the barn, explaining about the auction and Willow's condition. "She's due in about a month," he concluded as they reached the stall. Willow was dozing in the afternoon sun that streamed through the barn window. At the sound of voices, she lifted her head, ears pricked forward. When she saw Laura, she stepped forward, nickering softly in recognition. "Oh, Willow," Laura whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "You remember me, girl." Harold watched as the mare stretched her neck over the stall door, gently nudging Laura's shoulder. The gesture of forgiveness and affection was unmistakable. "She was my best brood mare," Laura said, wiping away tears. "Sweet temperament, never had trouble foaling. When the bank foreclosed, I begged them to let me keep her, at least until after she delivered, but they wouldn't listen." "What happened?" Harold asked quietly. Laura sighed. "The usual story. Economy tanked, medical bills piled up after my husband's accident, and the breeding business wasn't bringing in enough to cover the mortgage. We lost everything in less than a year." Harold nodded, all too familiar with how quickly life could change. "Well, she's got a home here for as long as she needs one," he assured Laura. "And so does her foal." They spent the next hour talking about Willow's history, her previous foals, all of which had gone on to successful careers as riding horses, her preferences for certain treats, and the little habits that made her unique. Before Laura left, she handed Harold a folder. "Her papers," she explained. "I kept copies hoping she'd be okay. She's registered as Whispering Willow, but we always just called her Willow." Harold thanked her, touched by the gesture. "You're welcome to visit any time," he said, surprising himself with the invitation. "I'm sure she'd like that." After Laura's departure, Harold returned to the barn with a renewed sense of responsibility. Willow wasn't just any rescue case. She was a cherished mare who had been deeply loved before circumstances tore her from her home. He owed it not just to Willow, but to Laura as well, to ensure the mare and her foal thrived. That evening, as Harold checked on Willow one last time before turning in, he noticed something different about her behavior. The mare seemed restless, shifting her weight from foot to foot and occasionally looking back at her sides. Concerned, he entered the stall, running a gentle hand over her belly. "What's the matter, girl? Something bothering you?" Willow bumped her nose against his chest, then continued her restless pacing. Harold checked her water, her hay, and the stall bedding, finding nothing amiss. Still, years of experience with pregnant mares had taught him to trust his instincts. He called Ellen, describing Willow's behavior in detail. "Could be early signs of colic," Ellen said, her voice concerned. "Or she might just be uncomfortable as the foal shifts position. I'll come out first thing in the morning, but call me immediately if she starts pawing the ground, rolling, or showing any signs of distress." Harold barely slept that night, checking the monitor every hour and making several trips to the barn. Willow remained restless but showed no worsening symptoms. By morning, she had settled somewhat, though she picked only half-heartedly at her breakfast. Ellen arrived just after sunrise, medical bag in hand. Her examination was thorough, checking vital signs and listening to gut sounds with her stethoscope. "I don't think it's colic," she finally said, straightening up. "Her gut sounds are normal, and there's no fever or elevated heart rate. But I am a bit concerned about the timing. Some mares get restless like this when they're preparing to foal." "But she's not due for another month," Harold protested. Ellen nodded. "That's what concerns me. Let's do an ultrasound to be safe." 20 minutes later, with Willow standing patiently for the procedure, Ellen's expression grew serious. "The foal's position has changed, and there's more fluid than I'd expect at this stage. I think she might be heading toward an early delivery." Harold felt his stomach drop. "Early? How early are we talking about?" Ellen's face was calm but serious. "It's hard to say for certain. Based on what Laura told you in my examinations, she should be at about 8 months now. That's early, but not catastrophically so. The foal has a chance if it comes now, but every additional day makes a difference." "What do we need to do?" Harold asked, his mind already racing through the preparations they'd made. None of them had accounted for a premature foal. "First, let's move her into the foaling stall and keep her as comfortable as possible. I'll give her something to help delay labor if that's what's starting. Then we need to prepare for the possibility of a premature foal." Ellen pulled out her phone. "I'm going to call the equine hospital in Grayson. They'll need to be on standby." As Ellen made her calls, Harold gently coaxed Willow into the foaling stall. The mare seemed reluctant to move, and once inside she circled restlessly before pawing at the straw. "Easy, girl," Harold murmured, trying to keep his own anxiety from showing in his voice. "Everything's going to be just fine." But as he stroked Willow's neck, he couldn't help remembering the last premature foal born on their farm, nearly 15 years ago. Despite Martha's round-the-clock care, the tiny colt had survived only 3 days. The memory of Martha's tears as they buried the little body still haunted him. Ellen returned, her expression somewhat relieved. "The hospital is ready if we need them. I've also called a colleague who specializes in neonatal foals. She's going to walk us through the preparations." For the next hour, Ellen administered medications to Willow and monitored her vital signs while Harold followed her colleague's instructions over the phone. He gathered clean towels, disinfectant for the umbilical cord, and a heat lamp that had been stored in the back of the barn since their chicken-raising days. We'll need colostrum if the mare doesn't produce enough, Ellen's colleague advised, and possibly plasma. How far are you from the clinic? About 45 minutes, Harold replied. That's not too bad. Keep the trailer hitched and ready just in case. As Harold worked, he called Rebecca, explaining the situation in terse, worried sentences. I'm on my way, she said without hesitation. Give me 20 minutes. True to her word, Rebecca arrived in record time, her truck skidding slightly on the gravel driveway. She hurried into the barn, her face tight with concern. Any changes? She asked. Harold shook his head. Ellen gave her something to try to stop the contractions, if that's what they are. She seems a bit calmer now. Rebecca nodded, immediately moving to check on Willow herself. The mare acknowledged her with a soft nicker, but her attention seemed inward-focused, her eyes occasionally distant as if listening to something only she could hear. I remember this look, Rebecca said softly. She's definitely in the early stages of something. Whether it's actual labor or just positioning discomfort, it's hard to say. The next few hours passed in a tense vigil. Ellen, Harold, and Rebecca took turns monitoring Willow, watching for any signs that her condition was worsening. By mid-afternoon, the mare had settled somewhat, occasionally dozing as she stood in the corner of the stall. This is a good sign, Ellen said cautiously. The medication seems to be helping. If we can delay labor even a few days, it gives the foal a better chance. Rebecca nodded in agreement. I've seen mares show pre-labor signs for weeks before actually foaling. Maybe that's all this is. Harold wanted to believe them, but something in his gut told him this wasn't a false alarm. He'd seen too many foalings not to recognize the subtle signs, the way Willow's muscles occasionally tensed along her flanks, the distant look in her eyes, the slight flaring of her nostrils. As evening approached, Ellen reluctantly prepared to leave. I have 2 other emergencies to check on, but I'll be back first thing in the morning. Call me immediately if anything changes. She handed Harold a syringe. This is a second dose of the medication. If she starts showing active labor signs before midnight, give her this and call me right away. After Ellen left, Rebecca insisted that Harold go to the house for dinner. You need to keep up your strength, she said firmly. I'll stay with Willow. I promise I'll call you if anything changes. Harold knew she was right, but leaving the barn felt like abandoning his post. Still, he trudged back to the house, heated some leftover stew, and forced himself to eat. As he was washing his dish, the phone rang. It was Laura Sanderson. I hope I'm not bothering you, she began. I just wanted to check on Willow. I had a strange feeling all day that something might be wrong. Harold hesitated, then decided honesty was best. She's showing signs of early labor. The vet's been here all day and we're doing everything we can to delay it. Laura's sharp intake of breath was audible over the line. Oh no, is there anything I can do? I could come over. Actually, Harold said, surprising himself, that might be good. She seemed to recognize you. Maybe your presence would help calm her. I'll be there in half an hour, Laura promised. True to her word, Laura arrived just as dusk was settling over the farm. Harold led her to the barn, where Rebecca was sitting on a bale of hay outside Willow's stall, keeping a watchful eye on the mare. Any changes? Harold asked anxiously. Rebecca shook her head. She's been quiet, even ate a little hay. Laura approached the stall cautiously. At the sight of her former owner, Willow's ears pricked forward, and she let out a soft whicker of recognition. Hello, beautiful girl, Laura said, her voice breaking slightly. You remember me, don't you? For the next hour, Laura sat in the stall with Willow, talking to her softly, stroking her neck, and singing snatches of what she explained were the songs she used to play in the barn during foaling season. She always liked music, Laura told them. It seemed to soothe her, especially when she was pregnant. Whether it was the medication, Laura's familiar presence, or simply Willow's own resilience, the mare remained calm throughout the evening. By 10 o'clock, Harold felt some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "Maybe we've dodged a bullet," he said cautiously. Rebecca nodded. "It's a good sign that she's stable. Each hour that passes gives that foal a better chance." They set up a rotation for the night watch. Harold would take the first shift until midnight, then Rebecca until 3, followed by Laura until morning. As Harold settled onto a hay bale near Willow's stall, he felt a curious sense of community. Just months ago, he had been facing his twilight years alone, withdrawn from the world around him. Now, in the face of crisis, he found himself surrounded by people who cared, not just about Willow and her unborn foal, but about him too. As the others left the barn, Harold turned down the lights and sat in the dimness, watching Willow. The mare stood quietly, occasionally shifting her weight but showing no signs of distress. "We're going to get through this," he told her softly. "All of us together." Willow turned her head to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the soft light. For a moment they regarded each other in perfect understanding. Then, as if coming to a decision, the mare carefully lowered herself to the straw-covered floor and lay on her side, her swollen belly rising and falling with each breath. Harold's heart skipped a beat. Mares rarely lie down unless they're either very comfortable or ready to foal. Given Willow's restlessness throughout the day, he suspected it wasn't relaxation driving her behavior. "Willow," he called softly, rising from the hay bale. The mare's eyes, usually so alert, had taken on a glassy, inward focus. Her sides heaved with a deeper breath, and then Harold saw it, the first unmistakable contraction rippling along her flank. A wave of panic washed over him, quickly replaced by the calm focus that had always come to him during emergencies on the farm. "Easy, girl," he murmured, moving quietly to Willow's head. "I'm right here with you." With one hand stroking her neck, Harold used the other to pull his cell phone from his pocket. Rebecca answered on the first ring. "She's down and contracting," Harold said without preamble. "It's starting." "I'll wake Laura and be right there," Rebecca replied, her voice instantly alert despite having been asleep. "Have you called Ellen?" "Doing that next." Ellen's phone went straight to voicemail. She was likely dealing with one of the other emergencies she'd mentioned. Harold left a terse message, then tried her emergency backup number. This time, a sleepy voice answered. "It's Harold Miller. Willow's in labor." "I'm on my way," Ellen said, the sleep vanishing from her voice. "How far apart are the contractions?" Harold watched as another ripple passed over Willow's belly. "About 5 minutes, I'd guess. She just went down." "That's good, we have some time. Give her the second dose of medication I left. It probably won't stop labor at this point, but it might slow things down until I get there. Keep her calm and watch for the water breaking." By the time Harold had administered the medication, Rebecca and Laura burst into the barn, both still pulling on jackets against the night chill. "Oh, Willow," Laura breathed, dropping to her knees beside the mare's head. "Not yet, sweetheart. It's too soon." Willow's eyes focused on Laura for a moment, a soft nicker escaping her before another contraction took her attention inward again. The mare's breathing had quickened, her sides moving more rapidly with each passing minute. Rebecca, meanwhile, had gone into efficient mode, laying out the clean towels and other supplies they'd prepared earlier. "Did you call Ellen?" Harold nodded. "She's on her way," said to keep Willow calm and watch for the water breaking. The next hour passed in tense anticipation. Willow's contractions gradually increased in frequency and intensity, but the amniotic sac remained intact. Laura sat at the mare's head, speaking soothingly and stroking her neck, while Harold and Rebecca took turns monitoring her progress and watching for Ellen's arrival. "Something doesn't feel right," Rebecca finally said, her brow furrowed with concern. The contractions are getting stronger, but she doesn't seem to be progressing to stage 2. Harold knew what she meant. In a normal foaling, once the contractions became regular and strong, the water would break, followed relatively quickly by the appearance of the foal. But Willow seemed stuck in the first stage of labor, her body trying to push the foal into position without success. Could the foal be positioned wrong? Laura asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in Harold's mind. Before Rebecca could answer, the barn door opened and Ellen hurried in, medical bag in hand. Her face was tense but composed as she quickly assessed the situation. "How long has she been like this?" she asked, pulling on examination gloves. "About an hour since the contractions became regular," Harold replied, "but no water breaking yet." Ellen nodded grimly. "I need to check the foal's position." The examination was brief but thorough. When Ellen withdrew her hand, her expression confirmed Harold's fears. "The foal is malpresented. One leg is back instead of extended forward. That's why labor isn't progressing normally." "Can you reposition it?" Rebecca asked. "I'm going to try, but with a premature foal we need to be extremely careful. The bones are more fragile and the foal is already stressed." Ellen met Harold's gaze. "I won't lie to you, this is serious. If we can't get the foal positioned correctly, we may need to consider a cesarean." Harold felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. A cesarean was risky for both mare and foal, especially under these conditions, but allowing a dystocia to continue was even more dangerous. "Do whatever you need to do," he said firmly. "Save them if you can." Ellen nodded, respect in her eyes, then turned back to Willow. "Let's give repositioning a try first. Rebecca, I'll need your help." For the next 30 minutes, Ellen worked with focused intensity, her arms covered in obstetrical lubricant as she carefully manipulated the foal inside Willow's womb. The mare, to her credit, remained relatively calm despite her discomfort, perhaps sensing that Ellen was trying to help. "I think, yes, I've got it," Ellen finally said, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool night air. "The leg is forward now, let's see if nature takes over from here." Almost as if on cue, Willow let out a low groan, and a gush of fluid spread across the straw bedding beneath her. The water had broken at last. The contractions intensified immediately, Willow's entire body tensing with the effort of pushing. "Here we go," Ellen said, positioning herself behind the mare. "Everyone ready?" Harold moved to Willow's head, taking over from Laura, who joined Rebecca in preparing to receive the foal. He stroked the mare's sweaty neck, murmuring encouragement as she strained. "That's it, girl. You're doing great. Just a little more now." The next contraction brought the first glimpse of the amniotic sac, pearly and glistening in the barn's dim light. Then came a tiny hoof, impossibly delicate, followed by a second. "Front legs first, that's good," Ellen commented, her focus unwavering. "Keep pushing, Willow." With each contraction, more of the foal emerged, spindly legs, then a small muzzle, and finally, with one tremendous push from Willow, the shoulders and body slipped free. The foal lay motionless in the straw, still encased in the amniotic membrane. "Clear the nostrils quickly," Ellen directed as she checked Willow for any signs of further complications. Rebecca was already moving, gently tearing the membrane away from the foal's nose and mouth, then using a clean towel to wipe the tiny face. The foal was small, much smaller than a full-term foal would be, with a fine coat that seemed almost translucent in places. "Is it breathing?" Harold asked, his voice tight with anxiety. For a heart-stopping moment, there was no response from the little body. Then, as Rebecca rubbed vigorously with the towel, the foal gave a weak cough, followed by a gasping breath. "That's it, little one," Rebecca encouraged, continuing the stimulation. "Keep breathing." Willow, exhausted but alert, had twisted her neck around to see her baby. She nickered softly, a sound so filled with maternal concern that it brought tears to Harold's eyes. The foal's ears twitched in response to its mother's voice, and it made a feeble attempt to lift its head. "It's alive," Laura whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But it's so small." Indeed, the foal was alarmingly tiny, its ribs clearly visible beneath the damp coat, its legs as thin as twigs. Ellen, having assured herself that Willow was stable, now turned her full attention to the newborn. "It's a filly," she announced after a quick examination. "And yes, she's premature. I'd estimate by about 3 to 4 weeks. The next few hours will be critical." As if understanding the gravity of Ellen's words, the tiny filly let out a soft, plaintive whinny that seemed to pierce Harold's heart. In that moment, looking at the fragile life struggling before him, he felt a surge of fierce protectiveness, unlike anything he'd experienced since Martha's illness. "What do we need to do?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Ellen's expression was serious, but not without hope. "Keep her warm, make sure she nurses as soon as possible for the colostrum, and watch for any signs of deterioration in her breathing or responsiveness. The fact that she's breathing on her own and responding to stimuli is a good sign, but she's not out of the woods by a long shot." The hours that followed were a blur of focused activity. Rebecca positioned the heat lamp to warm the fragile filly, while Ellen drew blood from Willow to test the quality of her colostrum. Laura stayed at Willow's head, keeping the exhausted mare calm as she recovered from the difficult birth. And Harold found himself kneeling in the straw beside the tiny foal, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he helped dry her coat with soft towels. "We need to get her standing if possible," Ellen explained. "Premature foals often have weak tendons, but movement will help strengthen them." The little filly, however, seemed to have no interest in attempting to rise. She lay curled in the straw, her breathing rapid and shallow, her eyes, dark and oversized in her tiny head, occasionally blinking up at the humans surrounding her. "Come on, little one," Harold encouraged, supporting her chest as Rebecca guided the spindly legs into position. "You can do this." The filly made a feeble attempt to push herself up, her legs splaying outward on the slippery straw. After several failed tries, Ellen shook her head. "Let's give her a break. If she can't stand on her own, we'll need to help her nurse by bringing Willow's udder to her." Getting a newly delivered mare to her feet was no small task, but Willow, as if sensing the urgency of the situation, responded to Laura's gentle coaxing with remarkable cooperation. Soon the mare was standing shakily, her sides still heaving from the exertion of labor, but her attention entirely focused on her newborn. "Good girl, Willow," Laura praised, stroking the mare's sweaty neck. "Now let's help your baby." Together, Ellen and Rebecca positioned the filly close to Willow's udder, while Harold and Laura steadied the mare. The first attempts were unsuccessful. The filly seemed unable to coordinate the sucking motion needed to draw out the vital colostrum. "This isn't working," Ellen said, her expression grim. "We need to milk out some colostrum and bottle feed her." The process was laborious and yielded only a small amount of the thick yellowish fluid. Ellen carefully fed it to the filly using a small bottle with a specialized nipple designed for foals. The tiny creature accepted it eagerly, her instinct to suckle apparently stronger than her ability to do so from her mother. "That's good," Ellen noted, her professional demeanor softening slightly at this small victory. "She's got a strong suck reflex, that's a positive sign." As dawn broke, casting pale light through the barn windows, the situation remained precarious. The filly had accepted 2 small feedings of colostrum but still couldn't stand. Her breathing, while steady, was more rapid than normal, and her temperature fluctuated worryingly. "I'm concerned about her lungs," Ellen admitted as she listened to the filly's chest with her stethoscope. "Premature foals often have underdeveloped respiratory systems, and she's showing some signs of neonatal maladjustment syndrome." "What does that mean?" Harold asked, his voice rough from fatigue and worry. "It's sometimes called dummy foal syndrome," Ellen explained. "The foal's brain is affected by oxygen deprivation or other birth trauma. They can't recognize their mother, can't nurse properly, and have poor coordination." The term hit Harold hard. He'd seen a dummy foal once, years ago, on a neighboring farm. The little colt had never managed to bond with his mother and had to be euthanized after days of decline despite intensive care. "What can we do?" he asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. Ellen's expression was compassionate but honest. "Keep her warm, continue the bottle feedings, and monitor her closely. I can give her medication to support her lungs and reduce brain swelling, but beyond that," she paused, "it's in nature's hands." As Ellen prepared the injections, Harold found himself sitting beside the filly, one hand resting lightly on her thin neck. Her coat, now dry, was a soft chestnut like her mother's, with a tiny white star barely visible on her forehead. "You fight," he whispered to her. "You hear me? Your mama and I were both fighters. You come from good stock." The filly's ear twitched at the sound of his voice, and her large dark eyes seemed to focus on him for a moment. Something about that look, so helpless yet somehow determined, reminded Harold of Martha in her final days. The same quiet dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. Laura appeared at his side, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. "Thought you could use this," she said softly, offering it to him. "Rebecca's gone to feed your other animals." Harold accepted the coffee gratefully, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. "Thank you for everything." Laura settled beside him on the straw, her gaze fixed on the tiny foal. "She's beautiful, isn't she? Even like this?" Harold nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in his throat. Beautiful and fragile and fighting for every breath, just like the life he'd tried to build after Martha, just like the tentative community forming around him now. "What will you name her?" Laura asked. The question caught Harold off guard. He hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead, afraid of jinxing the filly's tenuous hold on life. "I don't know," he admitted. "Seems premature, if you'll forgive the expression." Laura smiled tiredly. "Names have power, Harold. They give purpose." Her hand joined his on the filly's neck. "This little one needs all the purpose she can get." Harold considered this, watching as Ellen returned with the medication. The vet worked efficiently, administering the injections with practiced ease while explaining their purpose. Steroids for the lungs, anti-inflammatories for the brain swelling, antibiotics as a precaution. "I have to make my rounds," Ellen said when she finished, "but I'll be back this afternoon. Call me immediately if her condition changes. The next 24 hours are critical." After Ellen left, the barn fell into a quieter rhythm. Willow stood nearby, occasionally nickering softly to her foal, while Harold, Laura, and Rebecca took turns bottle feeding the filly, turning her to prevent pressure sores and monitoring her vital signs as Ellen had instructed. By mid-morning, exhaustion had caught up with all of them. Rebecca insisted that Harold take a break. "Go get some real sleep," she urged. "Laura and I will stay with them. We'll call you if anything changes." Harold wanted to protest, but his 72-year-old body had limits that his will couldn't overcome. He trudged back to the house, promising to return in 2 hours, and collapsed fully clothed onto his bed. He woke with a start to the sound of his phone ringing. Disoriented, he fumbled for it, his heart racing when he saw Rebecca's name on the screen. "Harold," she said, her voice tight with suppressed excitement, "you need to come to the barn. Now." Fear and hope warred in his chest as he hurried across the yard. Had the filly taken a turn for the worse? Or could it be? He pushed open the barn door, blinking to adjust his eyes to the dimmer light inside. And then he saw it, the tiny filly, wobbling precariously but undeniably standing on her own four legs. Willow stood nearby, her eyes bright with what looked remarkably like maternal pride. "She just did it," Laura whispered, tears streaming down her face. "All on her own. 1 minute she was lying there, and the next—" Harold approached slowly, afraid to disturb the miraculous tableau. The filly turned her head at his approach, ears pricked forward with interest. And then, with halting, uncertain steps, she moved toward him. 1 step, 2, 3, before her legs buckled and she sank back to the straw. "Did you see that?" Rebecca said, her voice choked with emotion. "She recognized you, Harold. She wanted to come to you." Harold felt a lump form in his throat as he knelt beside the exhausted filly. Those 3 steps, as wobbly and uncertain as they were, represented more than just physical progress. They were a declaration of will, a tiny miracle in the face of overwhelming odds. "Well done, little fighter," he murmured, gently stroking her neck. The filly responded with a soft nicker that sounded so much like her mother's that Harold couldn't help but smile. When Ellen returned that afternoon, she was cautiously optimistic about the filly's progress. "Standing on her own at this stage is a very good sign," she said, completing her examination, "and her lung sounds are slightly improved. The medications seem to be helping." She tried to walk to Harold, Rebecca added, unable to contain her excitement. 3 steps before she fell. Ellen raised an eyebrow, impressed. "She's imprinted on you," she told Harold. "That's unusual for a foal with maladjustment syndrome. They typically don't bond well with anyone, even their mothers." Harold nodded, remembering the moment when the filly's eyes had met his, that flash of connection that had felt almost like recognition. "What happens now?" he asked. "We continue the medications, keep up with the bottle feedings, and help her practice standing and walking as much as she can tolerate." Ellen's expression grew more serious. "She's not out of danger yet. The next few days will be critical for her development. But I will say this: she's a fighter." The following days fell into an exhausting but hopeful routine. Harold, Rebecca, and Laura took shifts, ensuring that someone was always with the filly. Ellen visited twice daily, adjusting medications and monitoring the tiny horse's progress. Slowly, incrementally, the filly began to show improvement. Her breathing became less labored, her temperature stabilized, and she began to stand for longer periods. By the 3rd day, she was able to nurse directly from Willow for short intervals, though they continued to supplement with bottle feedings. The mare had proven to be a patient and attentive mother, standing perfectly still while her wobbly offspring learned to navigate the complicated process of nursing. "She's got her mother's temperament," Laura observed as they watched Willow gently nuzzle her baby. Calm and steady, even under pressure. On the 5th day, Ellen arrived with cautiously good news. "Her blood work is showing improvement," she announced after drawing a small sample from the filly. "And her lungs sound clearer. I think we can start reducing some of the medications." That evening, as Harold sat beside the filly during his watch, he noticed something different about her. The glazed, distant look that had worried him so much in the beginning had been replaced by a bright alertness. When he spoke, her ears pricked forward attentively, and her large eyes followed his movements around the stall. "You're really in there now, aren't you?" he said softly. "Coming back to us." As if in answer, the filly struggled to her feet and took several steps toward him, her movements still awkward, but noticeably stronger than before. This time, she remained standing when she reached him, her small muzzle bumping against his chest in what felt remarkably like affection. Harold felt tears sting his eyes. In that moment, watching the tiny creature fight so valiantly for every milestone, he realized something profound had shifted within him. The paralysis of grief that had gripped him since Martha's death, the sense that life was simply something to be endured until its end, had been replaced by a fierce commitment to the present, to the fragile but persistent life before him. "Hope," he said suddenly, the name coming to him with perfect clarity. "That's your name, little one. Hope." The filly, Hope, nudged him again, as if approving her new identity. When Rebecca arrived to relieve him, Harold shared the name with undisguised emotion. "It suits her," Rebecca agreed, her eyes warm with understanding. "And not just her." Harold knew what she meant. Hope hadn't just entered the barn. It had re-entered his life as well, sneaking in through the cracks of his grief when he wasn't looking. By the end of the first week, Hope was standing reliably and walking with increasing confidence. Her appetite had improved dramatically, and she had begun to exhibit typical foal behaviors, curious explorations of her stall, playful headbutts against her human caretakers, and even short bursts of energy that resembled a foal's characteristic frolicking, though her premature condition made these episodes brief and somewhat clumsy. "I think we can cautiously say she's out of immediate danger," Ellen announced during her morning check. "She's still underweight and developmentally behind where a full-term foal would be, but she's compensating remarkably well." The news brought a wave of relief washing over Harold. He'd scarcely allowed himself to believe that Hope might actually survive, despite the promising signs. Now, hearing Ellen's professional assessment, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "When can she go outside?" he asked, thinking of the small paddock he'd prepared months ago, never imagining it would house such a special foal. "Let's give her another week indoors," Ellen advised. "Her immune system is still developing, and we want to keep her in a controlled environment a bit longer. But short trips outside for fresh air and sunshine would be beneficial as long as the weather's mild." The following day brought perfect spring weather, warm sunshine, a gentle breeze, and the scent of new growth filling the air. Harold decided it was time for Hope's first venture into the outside world. With Rebecca's help, he led Willow from the stall, the mare walking slowly and carefully, as if aware of her baby's limitations. Hope followed on wobbly legs, stopping occasionally when her strength faltered but always pushing forward again with remarkable determination. When they reached the small paddock adjacent to the barn, Harold opened the gate and stood back, watching as Willow stepped confidently into the sunshine. Hope hesitated at the threshold, her large eyes taking in the unfamiliar expanse of the paddock. The grass, the open sky, the distant trees, all new and potentially frightening to a foal who had known only the confines of a stall. "It's okay," Harold encouraged softly. "Your mama's right there." As if understanding his words, Hope took a tentative step forward, then another. When her hooves touched grass for the first time, she froze, head lowered to investigate this strange new surface. Then, with a sudden burst of energy that took Harold by surprise, she bounced awkwardly forward to Willow's side, her skinny tail flagged high in a brief moment of pure foal exuberance. Laura, who had arrived earlier to help with the morning feeding, laughed delightedly. "Would you look at that? She thinks she's a regular racehorse." The moment was brief. Hope's limited stamina meant she tired quickly, but it was a glimpse of the healthy foal she might become, against all odds. Word of Hope's miraculous progress had spread throughout the small community. Neighbors who had barely spoken to Harold since Martha's passing now stopped by regularly, bringing treats for Willow and gentle words of encouragement for the tiny filly. Some brought small gifts, a hand-knitted foal blanket from the elderly widow down the road, a specially formulated feed supplement from the owner of the local tack shop, a beautifully carved wooden nameplate for Hope's stall from the high school woodworking teacher. Each visitor remarked not just on Hope's remarkable fight for survival, but on the change in Harold himself. The withdrawn, grief-shadowed man they had grown accustomed to seeing had been replaced by someone more reminiscent of the Harold of old, engaged, purposeful, his eyes bright with renewed vigor. As spring deepened into summer, Hope transformed from the fragile, struggling newborn into a spirited young filly. Though still smaller than she should have been at her age, she made up for her size with boundless energy and curiosity. Each day brought new milestones: her first real gallop across the paddock, her first playful rear, her first roll in the dust. Harold documented them all, his phone filled with photos and videos that he shared proudly with anyone who expressed interest. Willow, too, had blossomed. Her coat gleamed in the sunlight, her eyes bright with contentment. She had proven to be an exceptional mother, patient with Hope's exuberance yet firm when needed. The bond between mare and foal was beautiful to witness, all the more precious for how close they had come to losing it entirely. One warm July morning, Harold sat on the fence watching Hope and Willow graze in the pasture. Rebecca's truck pulled up the driveway and she joined him, leaning against the weathered wood. "Hard to believe that's the same foal who couldn't even stand a few months ago," she commented, nodding toward Hope, who was now investigating a butterfly with intense concentration. Harold nodded, his chest tight with a peculiar mixture of pride and gratitude. "Ellen says she's caught up developmentally to where she should be. Might always be on the small side, but otherwise healthy as can be." "It's not just Hope who's transformed," Rebecca said, giving him a sidelong glance. "You've come a long way too, Harold." He couldn't deny it. The farm, which had fallen into disrepair after Martha's death, now hummed with renewed purpose. He'd repainted the barn, repaired fences, even planted Martha's favorite flowers along the driveway. The isolation he'd wrapped around himself like a protective cloak had been gradually shed, replaced by the warm embrace of community. "Never thought I'd feel this way again," he admitted. "After Martha, well, I figured that part of my life was over. Just marking time, you know?" Rebecca nodded, understanding in her eyes. And now, Harold watched as Hope abandoned the butterfly chase and trotted over to Willow, pressing her small body against her mother's side in a gesture of pure trust and affection. "Now I've got reasons to get up in the morning," he said simply. "Plans for tomorrow, things to look forward to." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle coming up the driveway. Harold turned to see a truck he didn't recognize, pulling a horse trailer behind it. He frowned, not expecting visitors. The truck parked near the barn, and a middle-aged man stepped out, his face vaguely familiar, though Harold couldn't immediately place him. As the man approached, recognition dawned. He was one of the workers from the auction house, the one who had handed Harold Willow's lead rope with such disinterest months ago. "Mr. Miller?" the man called, stopping at the fence. "Don't know if you remember me. Jake Carson. I work at the Greenfield auction." Harold nodded cautiously, suddenly protective of the peaceful scene before him. "I remember." Jake shifted uncomfortably, his eyes drawn to Hope and Willow in the pasture. "Heard around town about the mare and her foal. Quite a story. Thought I'd come see for myself." "Word travels," Harold acknowledged, still wary of the man's purpose. Jake's expression softened unexpectedly. "My sister's boy has special needs. Takes therapeutic riding lessons over at Dawson's place." He nodded toward Rebecca. "Miss Dawson here has been telling him about the miracle foal. Thought maybe he could see her sometime. Give him something to look forward to." The simple request, delivered with obvious difficulty by a man unaccustomed to asking favors, melted Harold's reserve. "Of course," he said. "Any time. Hope loves visitors." Relief washed over Jake's face. "Appreciate that. More than you know." He hesitated, then added, "Brought something for you, actually, from the auction house." He walked back to his trailer and lowered the ramp. To Harold's surprise, an elderly bay gelding stood inside, regarding them with calm, gentle eyes. "This is Old Red," Jake explained as he led the horse down the ramp. Been at the auction 3 times now. Nobody wants a 25-year-old horse with arthritis. Kill buyer would have taken him today for sure. Harold approached slowly, running a practiced eye over the gelding. Despite his age and the slight stiffness in his movement, Old Red was a handsome horse with a kind eye and dignified bearing. The boys at the auction pitched in. Jake continued, somewhat embarrassed. Thought maybe you'd have room for one more rescue case. After what you did with that mare and foal, well, seemed like the right place for him. Harold was speechless. The gesture, from men who saw hundreds of horses pass through the auction ring each month, most with uncertain futures, touched him deeply. Your old gelding might like the company, Jake added, and we figured you had a knack for the hard luck cases. Thunder, who had been watching the proceedings with interest from his own paddock, whickered softly as if in approval. The old gelding had been Harold's faithful companion through the darkest days of his grief, and though he never seemed lonely, Harold had sometimes wondered if he missed equine companionship. I'd be honored, Harold said finally, reaching out to stroke Old Red's nose. The gelding leaned into his touch with an immediacy that suggested he understood perfectly what was happening. He was being given another chance. By evening, Old Red had been settled into a stall next to Thunder's. The 2 geldings had touched noses over the partition with the dignified restraint of elderly gentlemen meeting for the first time at the barber shop, sizing each other up but finding no reason for objection. As Harold completed his evening chores, Laura arrived with a small gift, a framed photograph of Willow and Hope, taken on the day of the filly's birth. Despite the gravity of the situation captured in the image, the exhausted mare, the tiny, vulnerable foal, there was something profoundly hopeful about it. A beginning against all odds. For your wall, Laura said, handing it to him, to remember how far you've all come. Later that night, as Harold hung the photograph on the living room wall beside the faded wedding portrait of him and Martha, he felt a sense of completion. The lonely vacuum that had existed after Martha's death had been filled, not replaced, never that, but filled with new purpose, new connections, new love. He thought of the chain of events that had brought him to this moment, an impulse visit to an auction he'd never planned to attend, a bid he'd never intended to make, a rescue that had ended up saving not just Willow and Hope but Harold himself. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Harold stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, watching as the sun painted the pastures gold. In the distance, Willow grazed peacefully while Hope dashed about in exuberant circles, her small body vibrating with the joy of simply being alive. Thunder and Old Red stood companionably at their shared fence, 2 veterans enjoying the morning warmth. And all around, the farm that had once felt like a mausoleum to Harold's grief now pulsed with life and possibility. Martha would have loved this, he thought, the familiar ache of missing her tempered now by gratitude for the life they'd shared and the foundation it had given him. She would have especially loved Hope, the unexpected gift who had taught an old man to believe in second chances. As if sensing his thoughts, Hope paused in her morning frolic and looked directly at him across the distance. Then, with the grace that had seemed so improbable in those first desperate days, she kicked up her heels and galloped to her mother's side, a perfect emblem of resilience, joy, and the miraculous power of love to transform the abandoned and broken into something beautiful and whole.